Well, this, of course, the Soviet War, which lasts about 10 years, I believe, um, it really is a critical turning point for what comes later as well. As you mentioned, the Soviets are there with significant numbers of military troops and all of the hardware that they brought at the time. And against them are these different groups of mujahideen militias, supported in various ways, but to a considerable degree, by Pakistan, by Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, and of course by the United States. How did this evolve, this kind of collaboration between the Saudis, the Pakistanis, and the US, and these networks of ethnic-based militias?
Well, it's very interesting because it happened on two different levels. There was the official level and then what I might call the civil society level. On the official level, you have the United States increasingly pouring massive amounts of resources, almost all of it through Pakistan and Pakistan's security services, the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency of the military, being used as a funnel for arms and money, and increasingly sophisticated arms. At first it was Kalashnikovs and then other anti-aircraft weaponry, and then eventually Stinger missiles, these ground-to-air missile systems that the Mujahideen could carry on their shoulders to shoot down Soviet helicopters. And so you have this growing official support. At the same time, you have a movement of people who, coming from, particularly from countries like Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Egypt, who wanted to go and be part of the jihad, who saw this as a great opportunity, many of them disaffected with their own governments at home, who saw this as an opportunity to engage in a pure jihad, in fighting communism. And so you had people like Osama bin Laden who went to Pakistan as a young man and setting up with the Mujahideen in those camps in Pakistan, building cave networks and training facilities and creating medical facilities for the Mujahideen as they came out of Afghanistan wounded, educational facilities, mosques. And these were things that essentially, in tandem, people from the West, I mean, you had a Swedish committee for Afghanistan that was very active. You had a lot of American NGOs, not only those providing relief, but also who were engaged in some of these, providing support to the Mujahideen, building hospitals for the Mujahideen. And so you had this sort of civil outpouring that also formed networks of people who were interested in this movement.
We associate the emergence of the ideology of jihad because of with this struggle of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets. I wonder if this ideology of jihad, which we know best today because of Osama bin Laden and essentially the outside impulse to come to Afghanistan and fight, how was that mission of jihad perceived among the Afghans? They had a jihad to protect their own country, of course, against the Soviet invaders, but did they link that notion of jihad with this broad global effort to create a movement among young Muslim men around the world to create a jihad that was focused on Afghanistan but ultimately did not remain centered on Afghanistan?
It's a fascinating question because I think the answer is really a resounding no, which is one of the things that I think has been interesting about Afghanistan all through this period. The Afghans, and this is true for many of the Mujahideen, except for a few, were not extremists. They were not preaching Islamism in the sense of this notion of jihad and wanting to take over the world, as they were preaching liberation for Afghanistan. And of course, most of them famously came to Washington and were not, with a few notable exceptions, were not engaged in any kind of anti-Western rhetoric. And that really continued even through the Civil War period and even through the beginning of the Taliban. I mean, you can't find in the early stages of the Taliban rhetoric, there was nothing about carrying the jihad outside of Afghanistan. It really wasn't until Al-Qaeda sort of infiltrated into the Taliban that you started to have some of that discussion. But the Afghans have never really been about the sort of transnational, international jihadism. They've been much more focused on Afghanistan and pragmatic about wanting a peaceful Afghanistan as opposed to an occupied Afghanistan.